Hey, everybody. Today we are beginning our investigation into macroeconomics. And we'll begin our conversation by looking at what's known as the circular flow model, which is a model economists use to try and understand the transfer of goods and services throughout the economy. And then we'll move into discussing what is known as the gross domestic product. And we'll talk about how to measure GDP, and we'll differentiate between nominal GDP and real GDP and discuss why that difference is important. As far as the circular flow diagram goes, it's relatively simple. We start with the assumption that there are two different actors in the most basic version of this model. There are two different actors. There are households and there are firms. And the households own all of the factors of production, and the firms are renting those in order to make goods. And so we see that households sell or rent their factors of production in the factor market, and firms send money to the households in order to access those land, labor, capital factors. And the firms then use those factors of production to create goods and services that they sell to people in the household, in the households, in what's known as the goods and services market. And so you begin to see this sort of flow of money and services. The households give the factors of production, the firms then send money to the households. The households use that money to purchase the goods and services that the firms created using the factors of production that the households lease to them. And so money and products are going in a circular fashion. Now, obviously, this is a very simple model. It's missing other important actors. One of the largest actors in our economy is the government, and it's ignoring the fact that there are countries outside of our own that have citizens who want to purchase goods and services that we make. So the model gets a little bit more complicated when you start adding in government, because you've got taxes and transfer payments from the government. You've got people from the rest of the world purchasing our goods, people within our country purchasing goods from the rest of the world. It gets relatively complicated. The key here is that we can use this general model to begin to measure how much economic activity is occurring within our economy by looking at these major actors and looking at how much they're spending. This model leads us to the concept of gross domestic product, or GDP. And gross domestic product is the value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. That word final is important because goods, especially manufactured goods, tend to go through a process of development and creation and refinement. We start with the raw materials, and then those are used to create component parts that go into a larger product that then finally gets to the consumer's hands, like a car. Starts with steel and rubber and leather, and those components are then go into creating seats and steering wheels and tires and um, uh, motherboards and engines and all these bits and pieces. And those then become the car, and then the car gets sold to the end user. And so that's the end product. The car is the value that we care about. We don't want to include in our measure of GDP all of the different parts that went into making the car, because their cost and value is incorporated in the final price of the car itself. And so we're looking at all of the major actors and looking at their purchases in order to determine what our overall economic activity was in a given year. And so we've got four major actors: C, I, G, and then we have X minus M. And so we'll talk about each one of these groups here briefly. But I should say that this formula is very important. It's worth memorizing. It's worth tattooing to the inside of your eyeballs so that you never, ever forget it. Just say it to yourself over and over and over again until you don't until you know it by heart, that GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, C plus I plus G plus net exports. Just keep doing that. It's like a mantra. It will serve you very well throughout the rest of macroeconomics. So who is C? C are consumers. Those are private citizens, and that's their products and services that they're purchasing, not just the stuff, but then also the services that they receive from things like their accountants or their lawyers um, or their stockbrokers when they pay a commission to the stockbroker or to the Uber driver. All these services, they're not producing a hard, tangible product, but they're doing something for you, and so you pay them. Your tutors and stuff like that. That's C, or consumer spending. I is investment spending. That is businesses. They're spending on things like capital goods, and that means machinery, computers, and um, and bulldozers, and all of the things that are machine capital intensive goods. Construction of new buildings is considered part of investment spending. And then we talk about inventory, so the products that firms make, because sometimes what happens is the firm makes a good in 2022, but it doesn't get sold in 2022. It stays in what's known as inventory. Well, we want to measure what happened, what was the economic activity going on in 2022. And so even though the product itself didn't get sold in 2022, we assume or pretend as if the company has bought the product from itself at the end of the year so that we can count that productive activity as part of 2022, as part of the year when that product was made. And then we've got government at all levels and everything that the government spends money on. So whether it's computers, or buildings, or bullets, or planes, or police cars, all that stuff. Government spending in the given year, no matter what level, also counts. And then net exports. And what we're talking about here is our imports minus our exports. So X is exports. That's the value of goods made here, sold somewhere else. And then imports, the value of goods produced somewhere else and then purchased here. And so we sort of subtract imports from exports to make sure that we're capturing only money spent as on a net basis on goods made in a given country, in this case in the United States. So take a second, think about this. Which of these goods and services would be considered for GDP? Would the used car, the foreign made goods, Uber ride, apartment rent, stock sales, or new home construction? So go ahead and pause, think about it, and then unpause. And I'll tell you that the used car, it doesn't count. It's already counted once. It's not new, and so therefore not part of GDP. Foreign made goods, also not included, because we don't care about goods that are made in another country. That's their economic activity. We only care about goods that are made in our country because that's what we're measuring. So if we're worried about US GDP, we only want goods made in the US. If I'm worried about GDP of Germany, then I'll worry about products made there. It doesn't matter to me what they're doing. I only care about what's going on in this one particular country. Uber rides would count because every Uber ride is a new service. And because it's a service they're providing you, that would count. You're not buying the car, you're just buying that car's time. And every time you need a ride, a new service is created. Same with apartment rent. You're not buying the apartment. The apartment building may be old and decrepit. It doesn't matter because every time you rent the room, a new service is being provided. Also not counting stock sales. We don't care about stock. We get confused with investment. We think, well, if I'm an investor, then I buy stocks and bonds. That's true, but we're talking about investment spending, business spending. Stocks are not a product. They're not a thing. And even if they were, when you're buying and selling stock, they were previously owned by somebody else to begin with. And so we don't count investment purchases in that sort of investor idea. So stocks, bonds, mutual funds, those things, those financial services are not part of GDP, but new home construction is. When you buy a brand new home that's never been owned by anybody else, that would count for GDP. Once you sell the home, it no longer counts for GDP unless you're renting it, in which case they're not buying the home, they're buying the opportunity to borrow the space, and then it does count for GDP. So sometimes this gets a little confusing, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. The other question is, does an increase in GDP mean our economy is actually growing? Just because the GDP number is getting bigger, does that mean that we're doing well? And the answer here is maybe. It depends. And it depends on whether or not we're talking about nominal GDP or real GDP. So when we measure GDP, we want to know what are the total sales of a particular good. And then we're going to add all of the goods together and get a total number. And so we need to keep in mind that to figure out the total sale or value of goods produced. It's going to be the price of the good times the quantity made. And so we'll take the price times quantity of good X and good Y and good Z and all the goods in the economy and add them together, and that gets us total sales. Now, what that gives us is what's known as nominal GDP. It looks at a given year, at our current year, and what's the price this year, and how much do we make this year? We multiply the two together, and we get a number. Great. But does it really tell us much? The answer is no, not really, because that GDP number could go up because the price is higher, or it could go up because we're making more stuff. Ideally, we really want to be making more stuff. We want GDP to rise because we're making more things and more productive as an economy. So we need to hold something constant to make sure that the only reason GDP is going up is because we're more productive. And that's where real GDP comes in. In real GDP, we take our current quantity, what did we make, and use a base year price to see if the value of our economy is growing because we're making more things. Right? We're holding price constant so that the price isn't what's causing change in GDP, it's just change in quantity. This is very important to making sure that we can evaluate the health of the economy. So what does it matter? So we can look at this example here. We can pretend there's two different goods, corn and soybeans. And if that's true, then in 2018, we had 100 tons of corn at $100 a ton. We multiplied those two numbers together to find out the value of corn. And we have soybeans and their price, so 80 tons of soybeans, $50 a ton. Multiply those two together, we get a nominal GDP of $14,000. In 2019, we do the same process, 110 units of corn times 110 per ton, 80 tons of soybeans at $100 per ton. Multiply those and add them together, we get $20,100. And we look and we say, a nominal basis, we're killing it. We're doing a great job. Look, GDP just increased by $6,100. Aren't we great? But the problem is, if you look at the numbers, they're not producing a whole lot more. They're producing a little bit more, right? Corn's gone up a little bit. But the biggest driver to increasing GDP was that corn is now more expensive, and so is soybeans. Soybeans, in fact, has doubled in price. So we're not really doing all that well. And if you look at 2020 compared to 2018, again, we've done better. We have a bigger GDP by $5,600, but we're producing less corn than before and the same amount of soybeans. So in reality, our economy is shrinking, and that's bad. So what we want to do is look at real GDP. So we would say, okay, let's use 2018 as a base. Let's see how much would our production in 2019 have been worth if we had produced this amount in 2018. So I would say 110 tons of corn times the $100 price in 2018. The 80 tons of soybeans at the $50 price in 2018. Multiply and add those together, and I find my real GDP is $15,000. So yes, GDP went up, but not by nearly as much as we thought in nominal terms when we went from 2018 to 2019. And if I look at 2020, again, I take this year's quantity and multiply it by the base year price. So I would say 90 tons of corn times $100 per ton of corn, multiply those two together. I take 80 tons of soybeans times the $50 per ton price in our base year, multiply those two together and add them up. And when I do, I see real GDP is $13,000. And now I'm beginning to see that the economy isn't actually better. Just because nominal went up doesn't mean I'm producing more stuff. When I'm looking at 2020 in real terms, it turns out that I am producing less than before, and therefore real GDP has shrunk. This, I would say, is an opportunity for you to practice. Again, we're going to pretend that there are three goods, widgets, gizmos, and thingamajigs, and we're going to presume that 2019 is our base year. So I would encourage you to pause, work through the data, see if you come up to the same answers that I'm going to show you here in just a second. Assuming that you've paused it and worked through it, you should see that nominal GDP is $200. Real GDP in the base year is always the same as nominal, and you'll see the numbers for 2020. So hopefully you got those. Now, one last thing about GDP, and that is this. It's not a perfect measure. There are certain things that are positive that to our society that don't help GDP, sometimes actually hurt it. And there are certain things that help GDP that aren't necessarily good for the society. For example, volunteerism doesn't help GDP. When you're not getting paid to provide a service, you're doing it for free. You're not helping GDP, but you are helping the community, and that's a positive thing. Taking time off of work reduces the amount of money you have to be able to buy stuff, and that's bad for GDP, I guess, but good for you and your mental health. So probably worth doing. Do it yourself. Again, you could hire a plumber or you could fix it yourself. Doing it yourself lowers GDP spending, but gives you a certain level of satisfaction and helps you spend your money on something else. Okay. But at the same time, some things add to GDP, but they aren't good, right? If you live in a bad neighborhood that's riven with crime, then you might have to buy bars for your windows. That helps GDP, but it's not an indication of a great life for you. Hurricane cleanup may add to GDP in the sense that we have to, increase our construction. But if you look at what's known as broken windows fallacy, you'll realize that just because a hurricane came through and destroyed a bunch of houses and helped the construction industry short term, it's really a net negative for society because you've now lost all these homes. Not good. Tax prep software. Yeah, we got to spend it. It helps GDP to buy Quicken or TurboTax, but it doesn't make anyone any happier. It just keeps them out of jail. So GDP is not a perfect measure. It's certainly not that just because it's higher that everything is better. It just means that when GDP is higher, we're producing more stuff. And we'll have some more practice measuring GDP in class, and I'll be happy to answer questions there. And enjoy.